Good to see you. Just came back before Shabbos, having experienced the Beis Avel. My mother-in-law passed away, so it's good to be back. And Pikudei Hashem Yeshar Mesamchei Lev, we could come to Simcha by learning Hashem's Torah. We're discussing a fundamental issue here between the Rambam and the Ramban. What is the issue about? The Torah says, the Torah commands us to observe the mandates of the Sanhedrin, and the Torah gives us both an essay and a lo taseh. And then following that, the Torah tells us that a zaken mamre, if he rebels against the decision of the high court, is put to death. So the Ramban disagrees with the Rambam on the following two counts. Number one, he disagrees with the interpretation of the psukim, just simply in terms of the context of the psukim. The Rambam understands that the prohibition of lo tasur and the mitzvah of v'asisa kechol sheyerucha should be seen and understood independent of zaken mamre, and they encompass any takana, gzeira, any siag that the Rabbanan established. They vote. Let's say the highest court of Israel is made up of 70 judges. They take a vote, and they decide that chametz is prohibited in the 5th hour. We're afraid that if we allow you to eat chametz in the 5th hour, you might come to eat chametz in the 6th hour. Now, we have to oblige the Chachamim. We have to live up to their injunctions, their mandates, because lo tasur and v'asisa kol sheyerucha. If the zaken mamre rebels against the Chachamim and he rules that chametz is mutter during the 5th hour on Erev Pesach, then he's put to death. The Ramban, on the other hand, says that these psukim of lo tasur and vasisa kechol sheyerucha are not obligating and mandating us to listen to the Chachamim, because any takana, gzeira, siag, or minhag that is instituted by the Chachamim is not included in the DeOraisa, in the Torah violation of lo tasur. So that's point number one. Then it would seem from the Ramban that the reason why we have kulos and we're more lenient in DeRabanans, for example, the principle of Safek DeRabanan lekula, is because the DeRabanans are not included under lo tasur. And Rabbi Chanan now, in his development, this is the last thing we got up to for those who may recall, raises the following question. According to the Ramban, why do I have to listen? Why do I have to observe the DeRabanans, the laws of DeRabanan? By what authority? Bishleim, we understand according to the Rambam, when the Torah says lo tasur, and the Torah says v'asisa kechol sheyerucha, you have to fulfill and observe every injunction established by the Rabbanan. So I understand that the Torah is obligating me to do so, and if I violate that, I'm in violation of a lav and an essay. But according to the Ramban, what is the source? What is the basis for rabbinic authority? Why do I have to observe a DeRabanan? In the language of Rabbi Chanan, he says, Tema Gedola. He says there's an unbelievable question to be raised here on the Shitas Ramban. he says that according to the Ramban, let me just read his language here. This is on page Tzadi, which we sent out. He says, Me'eze tam anu chayovim lishma lahem. You know, I picture in my mind Rebbe Chanan Wasserman, you know, one of the great Rosh Hashivas of his time, and he's asking the question, why do we have to listen to the Rabbanan? Could you imagine that? You know, Me'eze tam anu chayovim lishma lechachamim v'shelo lavar al divrayim. There's no obligation from the Torah to listen to the Chachamim. Because according to the Ramban, Lo Tasur is referring to decisions that are handed down by the Beis Din HaGadol. Right? There was a case, and there was a litigant and a dispute, and there was a back and forth, until finally the Sanhedrin were Omed Leminyan, and they took a vote, and they decided, and they ruled, and now the Zaken Mamre gets up, and he rebels against them. That's the parsha of Zaken Mamre. But a DeRabanan is not DeOraisa. A DeRabanan is not governed or generated by Lo Tasur, by a DeOraisa. And according to the Ramban, if I violated DeRabanan, I violated DeRabanan, but not a DeOraisa of Lo Tasur. And the Ramban objects to the Rambam because he says, according to the Rambam, we should be at least as machmir in DeRabanans, if not more so, because a DeOraisa is usually one lav. And here in the DeRabanan, according to the Rambam, I violate not only a lav, but an essay. So how could we justify Safek DeRabanan L'Kula? The Ramban himself offers in his intellectual honesty a possible answer to that question. He says maybe when the Rabbanon instituted their injunctions and their Gzeros and Syagos and Harchakos and Isurim and Mitzvos and so forth and so on, they put in a Tanai, they put in a built-in condition that this obligation and this prohibition only applies in a situation of Vadai, but not in a situation of doubt, of Safek. But the Ramban says that ein elu dvarim hagunim ve'lo shal ikar. He says, I can't accept that. He's not comfortable with the fact that the Rabbanan may have put in a condition into their original injunction that it only applies in Vadai and not in Safek. And therefore comes out, according to the Ramban, that Ein lanu shum tzivi b'Torah. We have no mitzvah in the Torah whatsoever to listen to the Chachamim. Lo mikra, not from the pasuk. Lo me'alacha. There's no halacha l'Moshe Sinai. V'lo misvara. There's no logic behind it. Because again, if you're going to tell me it's a svara, then havile DeOraisa. Then the Ramban would have to agree to the Rambam's position that every DeRabanan is DeOraisa because svara is DeOraisa. Kedamrina b'chol duchti, as we see all of a shas. Lama likra, we don't need a pasuk. Svara, alma svara ukra chadinahen. The status of svara is equal to that of a kra, of a pasuk, and they're both DeOraisa. And then we're going to have to say something DeOraisa lechumra in every DeRabanan because it's based on svara. You know, when I read this Rebbe Chanan, I begin to say to myself, what a colossal enterprise the Rebbe Chanan took upon himself to wiggle out of this problem. When Rebbe Chanan is established that according to Ramban, there's no source in the Torah whatsoever for the DeRabanans. So why do I have to fulfill the DeRabanans if there's no source in the Torah? And brilliantly, Rebbe Chanan comes up with a sugya like from left field that you and I perhaps would never think of in this context. What, you know, as my kids always say to me, ma kesher, you know. The Gemara in Yevamos, Adaf Samach Beis, Tanya, we learn in a Brisa, Gimel Dvarim Asa Moshe Rabbeinu Midaito. There were three halachic decisions and actions that were taken by Moshe Rabbeinu midaito, on his own initiative. Viskima daito l'das hamakom. And somehow Moshe Rabbeinu in his greatness was able to figure out what the Ribono Shalom would have wanted. And he got it right 3 times over. Number 1, Pirish Mina Isha, he separated from his wife. And that's the whole story of the Lashon Hara of Miriam and Aaron, right? Shibeas HaLuchos, Moshe's own decision to break the Luchos, the holy Luchos, the Luchos HaBris that were written with the hands of the Ribono Shalom. Hosif Yom Echad of Prisha, right? God required Prisha of 2 days, and Moshe Rabbeinu added a 3rd day. Ubi Gemara Sham, the Gemara asks, what gave Moshe Rabbeinu the gumption, to make these 3 decisions on his own? Umefarish al kol echad me'advarim mai darash mikra o mikal v'chomer. So the Gemara at simple level seems to assume that Moshe Rabbeinu in each case he had a drush or he had a kal v'chomer. Tosfos says that's impossible. If it was a kal v'chomer, then how could the Gemara say it's midaito? Kal v'chomer is one of the Yud Gimel Midos Shator Nidreshes Bahem, and we derive halachas through a kal v'chomer. That's DeOraisa. That's something that comes from the Torah itself. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu midaito. Then Tosfos goes on to prove that there is no real fraud. There's no proof from any pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu learned from the Torah that he has to break the luchos, he has to be poresh mishto another day, and so forth. That the prisha. V'kasha imkein hadra kushiyas haGemara leduchta. The Gemara asks, so what was the basis for Moshe Rabbeinu's 3 decisions? And the Gemara answers kra or kal v'chomer, but Tosfos says it's not a kra and it's not a kal v'chomer, because if it were, then it's not midaito. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu making his own decision. So we're really caught in the bind over here. We're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, if it's midaito, then the question of the Gemara is a very pressing question. What gave Moshe Rabbeinu the gumption to make these decisions on his own? If, on the other hand, he derives it from a kal v'chomer, then it's not midaito. And the Gemara says these are 3 decisions that Moshe made midaito. So this is a case of a good Jew who answers one question by asking another question. So Rabbi Chana is starting with the question, how does the Ramban justify our obligation to fulfill DeRabanans, takonos, yagos, harchakos, and mitzvos DeRabanan? And now he says, let's ask another question. What does it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu made these decisions midaito? As the Gemara objects, how could it be midaito? V'nireh. This is on the left column on page Tzadi, if you're following the text. The hados if yom echad eino ela midrabanan. The mitzvah of Prisha is only 2 days on a DeOraisa level. The Rabbanan, in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, added a 3rd day. The Gemara says that how did Moshe Rabbeinu come to this? Kra o kal v'chomer, hu rak asmachta. So here Rabbi Chanan introduces a concept that we're familiar with in the Talmud, but maybe we don't really pay attention to it, called an asmachta. He says you can punch it into Barilan and do a word search, and you'll find many, many sugyas in Shas where it says D'Rabanan ukra asmachta b'alma. Umikol makom, even though the kra is only an asmachta, it's not really a derivation, it's only a D'Rabanan. Nevertheless, hiskima daito l'das hamakom. What we see here in Moshe Rabbeinu, this is going to be the major breakthrough to create a framework for understanding the Ramban and all the DeRabanans, is that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to figure out the divine will, and God gave his haskama. He added his seal of approval. That God sometimes does not give us an explicit command, a mandate. He leaves it to man to figure out, by reading between the lines, what is the will of God. And that becomes the DeRabanan because it's not included in the explicit Torah, but it's the DeRabanan coming up and figuring out what is the will of God. For Hu Adin, this is going to create a breakthrough framework for the Ramban. Bechol mitzvos v'isurim shel divrayim. Like, for example, we have the mitzvah of Hanukkah today. We have the mitzvah of Megillah on Purim. We have Erevin, and we have, what shall I say, Netilas Yadayim, and so forth and so on. And then we have Isurim, like, for example, Chametz in the 5th hour, and many, many other Isurim DeRabanan. Hiskima daitom l'das hamakom. When the Rabbanan instituted all these mitzvahs and Isurim, they came up and they were able to figure out what would be the divine will. Lidugma, he gives an example. Kisha asru shnios larayos. Right, so let's say you're not allowed to have a relationship with a grandfather with a granddaughter, right? That's shnios larayos. So on the one hand, it's the Rabbanan, but Gam Ratzon Hashem Yispara. God also wants there to be an Isur Shnios, but he doesn't include it in the Torah, and therefore it drops one level from a DeOraisa to the DeRabanan. Shalot Tzival Zeh Torah Mefurash. It's not explicit in the Torah. And once again, Rabbi Chanan pulls a rabbit from left field, and he quotes the Rambam in Perek Chavdal Milchus Shabbos, the famous Rambam about muktzah. Why did the Rabbanan prohibit muktzah on Shabbos? The Rambam is famous for saying that muktzah really changes our entire experience of Shabbos. The Rambam says, "Asru chacham letaltel mixas dvarim b'Shabbos kederech shu'osu b'chol." Why did the Rabbanan say that I can't move objects, many, many objects, that I can move during the week? Mipnei ma nagu be'isur zeh amru. Uma im izhiru anavim v'tzivu shlo yehi luchach b'Shabbos ki luchach b'chol v'lo sichas Shabbos ki sichas achol shenemar v'davru davar. Yeshaya Novi tells us that we have to change our speech and our hiluch, the way we walk on Shabbos, in order to create a new experience of Shabbos. That Shabbos is what we call a day of menucha, a day of shvisa, nikeres. It's different than every other day of the week. Is kal v'chomer mishmosa shlo yeh tiltul b'Shabbos ketiltul b'chol. Says the Rambam, if we would be allowed to move all our objects on Shabbos the way we do the rest of the week, is kidei shelo yeh kiyom chol b'einov. Certainly, it would be like a weekday in his eyes. I remember my mother, Aleh Shalom. She used to like to move furniture around. I don't know if anybody has that same experience, right? Imagine the living room, and every Montag and Darnishtik, every Monday and Thursday, she decided to move things around and change, from here to there and everything else. Says the Rambam, imagine if this was permissible on Shabbos and you could move every object, whatever you please. L'taken kelim mipina l'pina, start moving your vessels from one corner to the other. Mibayis l'bayis, let's niavanim, you have stones that maybe you want to use as bricks, start moving them around and piling them up and so forth and so on. Hareu batel v'yoshev b'beso. He's sitting in his house the whole of Shabbos, Yevakesh Dover Shisasik Bo. And he's involved in whatever he's involved in, physical exertion, V'nimtza Shlo Shavas, He's not resting on Shabbos. Ubatel hatam shenever v'torah l'man yanuach. The Torah says that Shabbos was given as a day of menucha, but he's moving around Kalim. He's moving around Muktzah. Says Rabbi Chanan, the Rambam admits that tiltul muktzah is only an isur DeRabanan. It's not DeOraisa. The Torah says l'man yanuach, but the Torah doesn't say that you're not allowed to move muktzah. V'ha essay to violate l'man yanuach eno ela biyosa malachos hasuras b'Shabbos. If he does malacha, he's not in a state of menucha. But tiltul avanim mipina lepina, moving stones from one corner of the room to the other, that's not considered a violation of l'man yanuach. Aval kavanasa, what does the Rambam mean? Dezeu neged ratzon haTorah. In other words, what the Rabbanan are doing here is they're understanding what is the will and the goal of the Torah when it says l'man yanuach, that Shabbos is a day of menucha. And they're figuring out by analyzing the will of the Torah that muktzah is not something that we want to dedicate our Shabbos to. Tiltul kelim mimakom lemakom avanim mipina lepina. But the Torah doesn't in any way prohibit moving muktzah. So it's only a DeRabanan. But it's a DeRabanan which tells me that we can understand, the Rabbanan can understand, not me and you maybe, but the Rabbanan are authorized to understand what is the will of Hashem. Just like we saw in the precedent of Moshe Rabbeinu 3 times over, he filled out an iskima daito l'das hamakom. And now, in the example of tiltul muktzah, the way the Rambam formulates to figure out what is the will of Hashem when he said l'man yanuach, and how to achieve menucha on Shabbos. And for this reason, anu chayovim lasos k'divreihem. Why? Because the ultimate responsibility of a Jew is to fulfill the will of God. It may take the Rabbanan to reveal the will of God. But once they do so, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu agrees to his 3 initiatives and so forth, so too God gives his stamp of approval to every single DeRabanan, whether it's mitzvahs DeRabanan, isur DeRabanan, siagos, and minhagos, and so forth and so on. The afal pi, even though lo ba leim tzivui mefurish b'Torah, even though the Torah doesn't say it explicitly, and therefore it's not the same chumrah, it's kal with the kuf, it's lenient vis-a-vis a DeOraisa that's explicit in the Torah, but nevertheless, it is the Ratzon Hashem. Now, I would like to add my own sort of addendum to Rabbi Chanan. I think that in the light of Rabbi Chanan, I could begin perhaps to understand another concept which always bothered my mind. If you're familiar with Brisk, a little bit even, you'll know that in Brisk, there's a concept called mitzvah kiyumis. What's a mitzvah kiyumis? Like, for example, Reb Chaim writes in Hilchos Tefillah that you could be mekayim the mitzvah of tefillah above and beyond your obligation to do so. He quotes Reb Yochanan in Masechta Brachos, Halavai sheyispal adam kol hayom kula, that a person could daven the whole day. And we have a concept called tefillas nedava. And in Brisk, this is a major concept called a mitzvah kiyumis, a mitzvah which is not obligatory, but you fulfill the mitzvah nevertheless. Now, I don't understand. What's a mitzvah kiyumis? Either I'm obligated or I'm not obligated. If the Torah doesn't obligate me, you give me two ice creams. You know, you give me vanilla and you give me chocolate, or for my wife, coffee, right? So I can decide which ice cream I want to eat. You wouldn't call that a mitzvah kiyumis. I'm not obligated to eat one ice cream over the other. My wife offers me for dinner a choice of chicken or steak. I'll decide if I'm in the mood for steak or if I'm in the mood for chicken. That's not a mitzvah. So what is this concept of mitzvah kiyumis? If it's a mitzvah, it's a mitzvah. And if it's not a mitzvah, then it's irrelevant. But I think perhaps in the light of this breakthrough of Rabbi Chanan, I begin to shed a light on this concept of mitzvah kiyumis. A mitzvah kiyumis means that the Torah doesn't explicitly obligate me, but that I can figure out the ratzon of Hashem. I can understand through a mitzvah kiyumis when I should take the initiative and iskima daito ledas hamakom. He says, "V'yoser mizem atzinu afilu advarmen ilmadu b'mido shator nidreshes b'hem sheim DeOraisa mamish mikom makom ein kalim." Rebbe Chanan now sets up a hierarchy of mitzvos and isurim that go from the lower echelon, less severe, to the more and more lenient, to the more severe and more severe. There's a whole structure. You can have something that's derived from midol shator nidreshes bahen, and therefore it's DeOraisa. Yet it doesn't have the same chumrah as something which is explicit in the Torah. B'dar zeh mavur b'tosus parakam divamis daf zayin shehikshu leman diomer bia b'miktzas shmei bia mikom makom hutar lemitzora lahachnis yadav lebahomnos imkein yemutulo gam lichnos kulo v'tirtzu yeshlamdo nicha sheyidcha bias kulo tichsiv behedja vel amigdash lo yava aval bia b'miktzas lo ksiv behedja elamei kesha, etc. He says the following: we have the problem of mitzora. A mitzora who's tameh, in order to purify himself, he needs what's called matan bahonos. So he's got to put his fingers and his toes into the azara, because the matan bahonos have to take place in the azara. But he's tameh; he's not allowed to enter into the azara. So the Gemara offers the solution called bia b'miktzas. What does that mean? That for the sake of taras hamitzora, we're going to permit him as a tameh to enter into the azar, but only b'miktzas, only part of his body. So Tosas asks, but we paskin that bia b'miktzas shmei bia, that you can violate the isur of bias migdash b'tumah even if only part of your body enters into, a limb of your body enters into the azara. So how can we allow this in the case of taras hamitzora? The Tosas answers that bia b'miktzas is not explicit in the Torah. The Torah just says that a tameh is not allowed to enter into the azara, into the kodesh, which means his entire body enters into it. But we derive through a hekesh, that bia b'miktzas shmei bia, that even partial entry into the migdash b'tumah is prohibited. Says Tosfos, in a case of bia b'miktzas, which is derived from hekesha, and it's not explicit in the Torah, we can override that isur for the sake of taras hamitzora. We will not override the isur, as Tosfos asked, and let the mitzora go into the Beis Hamikdash totally with his entire guf, because that's explicit in the Torah. You see, says Rabbi Chanan, that there are different gradations and levels of severity depending upon how explicit it is in the Torah. Or, for example, halacha l'Moshe miSinai, which is certainly DeOraisa, and yet it doesn't have the same stringency as that which is mefurish b'Torah. So, for example, we find that Arla in Chutz La'aretz is halacha l'Moshe miSinai, but yet in the case of Safek, we'll be mekil and we'll allow Arla in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because it's only halacha l'Moshe miSinai. What do you mean? Halacha Moshe miSinai is DeOraisa. How can you be mekil in the case of Safek? But again, it's not explicit in the Torah, and therefore drops down one level of severity. You have this entire hierarchy, a whole triangle. Or, for example, the Ran says at the end of Masechta Yuma that if somebody eats chas v'sholom on Yom Kippur, you don't have to make a mecha. You don't have to yell and scream. If you see someone violating the Shabbos, you have to say Shabbos, Shabbos, Shabbos. Okay, in our context in contemporary life, we're not going to do that for whatever reason, but that's the pure ideal halacha. You have to make a machah. You have to protest. But in the case of Inisem Esnafshel Sechem, which is not explicit in the Torah, and here's where the Ran makes his famous distinction between Achil and Shasi on Yom Kippur, as opposed to the other three Nuyim. The other three Nuyim are not explicit in the Torah, and therefore you don't have to make a machah. So you see that there are gradations. And the DeRabanans, even though they're the will of Hashem, because it's Kima Daito L'Daito, but nevertheless, on the scale of severity, they are the lowest rung, and Safek DeRabanan L'Kula. The Ran also in Nedarim has another nafkamin. He says that normally, if you take a shvuah against the Torah, the shvuah is not chal. But if you take a shvuah against something which is DeOraisa, but it's not explicit in the Torah, the shvuah overrides the Isa Torah, and it's chal. He says, Taimo shel davar, Hoshut misvar, the kevan shanu roim shatorah haricha b'davar zeh. This is another sugya in Shas. This is a sugya, I believe, in Zvachim. There's a difference between chatos and asham as far as yisod is concerned. Although both require yisod, which means shvichas dam al yisod, but in chatos it's explicit in the Torah. In asham it's not explicit. And that puts chatos on a higher level than asham. In other words, the requirement of chatos in terms of yisod is explicit in the Torah, and therefore it puts it on a higher level. So, for example, if there was an issue of kedima, which carbon to bring first, a chatos or an asham, we're going to bring a chatos first because it's mekudash michaver. It has a higher level of kedusha. And why does it have a high level of kedusha? Because it's explicit in the Torah. Then Rabbi Chanan quotes the sugya in Kedushin on Daf Tesvav with regard to Batei Ari Choma and this halach of Geula. Mi she'eno nigal bi'ela pirish de lo ksiv b'kra beheja sheyigal bi'ela nigal b'sheish. Nimkar li oved kochaven. T'chsiv beheja b'kra she'nigal bi'ela. Eino din sheyigal b'sheish. The time of shal davar, he says, mefurash, pashut misvar, the kemen shanu roim, shatorah aricha b'davar zeh, yosef michavero, mistamer hu chashuv yosef. Interesting, he quotes a Rashi in Chai Sarah. Rashi talks about, why the Torah is marich and all the story of Eliezer, Eved Avram, all these calculations and thoughts. So Rashi says that Yofe Sichasan shall avdei avos lifnei hamakom Yosef v'torasan shall banim. Sharei v'parsha shall Eliezer Eved Avram nichpula shtei pa'amin. He says that the parsha of Eliezer is twice. There's once when Eliezer is thinking out himself, and then the Torah repeats it when Eliezer conveys this to Lavan and Besuel. And he says, Harbi Gufi Torah lo nitnu ela beremiza. I mean, like the whole of Shabbos, 39 malachas, is written in one remez when it says Kol malacha lo sasa. Haresha Chazal heiru bazeh. The more it's explicit in the Torah, the more chaviv is in front of Hashem. It's chashuv in front of Hashem. So kol isur shel divrayim, no lo nemru klal, an isa divrayim is not written in Torah at all. Let's say, for example, we pass like Rabbi Yossi Aglili that chicken and milk is only DeRabanan, and the Torah says gedi. Gedi means basa, not oath. Means basa behema chayav yof. But here it doesn't mean oaf, it means gedi. So that's not explicit in the Torah at all. We know from the Chachamim, shekachu ritzono. It's not even a remez in the Torah. So we have all these gradations, and it gets more and more severe as it gets closer to mafurash explicit in the Torah. But in the case of a DeRabanan, it's pure. It has no remiza in the Torah at all. It's purely a gzera DeRabanan. But on a yodim midivrei chachamim shekach hu ritzono yisparach shmo, and therefore it's kal with a kuf yosem midvar man ilmodim bidrash Torah shebal peh. Now, what I'd like to do in the time that we have remaining is to read the Ramban in the original. In other words, we've been quoting the Ramban from a secondary source, from Rebbe Chanan, his Kunshus Midivrei Sofrim. But what I have in front of me here, I mean, this is one particular publication. It's called the Frankel edition of the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvahs. But you can get the Sefer HaMitzvahs in many different editions. I like this one because he quotes all the sources. He tells you where the Ramban is coming from. Now, in order to appreciate the Ramban, let's understand the Rambam. And the Ramban is coming to defend the Bahag against the argument, the slings and arrows of the Rambam. The Rambam shoots slings and arrows at the Baal Halachas Gedolos. He never mentions him by name because the Baal Halachas Gedolos counts mitzvos DeRabanan in the Taryag. Right, we have a Gemara at the end of Makis. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Morasha Kilos Yaakov. Torah is Gematria Tafresh Yud Aleph 611, and Shnayim Mipi Adibur, and that's Lo Yilecha and Anochi Hashem Elkecha, and therefore we jack it up to 613. So we know that there are 613 mitzvahs, and amongst those 613, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, who lived a generation before the Rambam, counts the DeRabanans. So, for example, tonight we'll light Ner Chanukah. According to the Bahag, Ner Chanukah is one of the Taryag mitzvahs. And the Rambam says, I wouldn't have even bothered to talk about this Bahag. I don't have to waste my time telling you why this is impossible. The Gemara says at the end of Masechta Makos that 613 mitzvahs were transmitted to Moshe at Har Sinai. Eich nomar, how could we even entertain the idea, says the Rambam? Shedavar shehu DeRabanan hu bechlal minyan mitzvahs? Do I even have to bother wasting my breath? That something that's DeRabanan is included in the 613 mitzvahs that were given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai? Amal Heiruni, all of the reason why I'm wasting my time is with Nesha Tobo Rabim. I don't know who the Rabim are, but he's saying there were many who made a mistake. I know of the Bahag. Umanu, and they counted in the 613 Ner Chanukah, Mikra Megillah, Bichal Mitzvahs Hasei. Right, we have Ramach, Mitzvahs Hasei, and two of those three of those 248 are what? Are Chanukah and Purim. V'chein Mea Brachas B'chol Yom. That's also considered Mitzvah Hasei. Nicham Avelim, Bikur Cholim, Kvuras Mesim, Halboshas Harumim, Chishiv Tkufos Mazolos, Ushmones Reyom Ligmar Ben Esahala. There are 18 days in the calendar, 21 in Chutzlitz, but 18 here in Etzol when we read the entire Hal. All that is counted in Taryag Mitzvahs. Vehistakel Mimisha Yishma L'Shonom, and listen carefully to their language. Nemru lo Moshe Sinai? that these mitzvahs were given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai? The Yimna Kriyas HaHallel? Sheshiba Ko David Olav HaShalom? David HaMelech created Hallel. Ha'el Yis'ale Shetziva Ba Moshe? The Yimna Ner Chanukah Shekavu Chachamim V'Bayisheni? The Chacham established Ner Chanukah Bayisheni, way after Har Sinai. V'chein Mikra Megillah. A Mikra Megillah is in the period between Bayis Rishon and Bayisheni. Omnam Heyos Moshe Nemar Lo B'Sinai Shiyitzavenu Ki Ksheyia B'Achris Malchatenu V'Yikra Lanu V'Mayevonim Kach V'Kach Yischayev L'Ner Shenadlik Ner Chanukah Hine Eini Roeh She'echad Yidmezeh O Sheyalav Machshavto. Are you telling me that HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai told Moshe Rabbeinu that if at the end of one of our periods of Malchus, it's going to happen that the Greeks will overcome us and defile our Kedusha, that will be Chayav and Ner Chanukah when God's salvation takes place? Says the Rambam, that's very far-fetched. And if you'll ask me, Mashi Yira Li, if you ask me what brought the Bahag to make this terrible mistake and count mitzvahs DeRabanan in Taryag, because on these mitzvahs we make a bracha asher kidsharon tzolsa tzivanu al mikra megillah ulahadlik ner shel Chanukah v'ligmar sahallel. So this is the Gemara's question. Shelas HaTalmud, the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Chav Gimel, Heichon Tzivanu. How can you say asher kidsharon tzolsa v'tzivanu on mikra megillah and on ner Chanukah? What do you mean tzivanu? Where did Hashem command us? And the Gemara answers, "V'yamru malo Tasur." The Torah says, "Don't deviate from that which the Chachamim tell you." This is the famous Rambam that every DeRabanan comes under lo Tasur. So if a person makes a decision, I am not going to light Ner Chanukah, he is in violation of a DeOraisa of lo Tasur. The imitam zem manu osam, if they want to be consistent about it. And every time we make a bracha, asher kidshanim v'tzosav v'tzivanu, we should count it as part of the Taryag. Hine roi sheyibnu kol davar shu DeRabanan. Why do you pick and choose? Every single DeRabanan should be counted under Taryag because they're all included under lo Tasur. Every DeRabanan. V'ki kol masha amru chachamim lasoso v'kol masha ishiru mimenu kvar tzivo l'Moshe Rabbeinu Har Sinai. You're going to tell me that already at Har Sinai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu already told Moshe Rabbeinu every single DeRabanan, and therefore it's included in Taryag. Al pi haTorah sheyorucha v'hamishpat sheyomu l'chatase v'izharnu v'ziranu mi'avar b'davar mikol ma shetiknu o gazru v'yomu lo tosu mikol davar sheyagilucha v'yivinu small, is then you should count every single DeRabanan. V'yimnim mikol ma shu DeRabanan b'chal Taryag mitzvahs. If you're going to count every single DeRabanan included in Taryag, according to the Bahag, mipnei shu nichnas tachas amro yisbarach lo Tasur, because it's included under lo Tasur. Mipnei ma manu befrat elu. Why do you specify these? V'lo manu zulasa. To the same extent that you count Ner Chanukah or Mikra Megillah as two of the 613, hoyelem lamanos, they should have counted Netilas Yadayim, Mitzvahs Eruv. Ki hine anu mevarchim asher kidshanim v'tzosav tzivanu al Netilas Yadayim. Asher kidshanim v'tzosav tzivanu al Mitzvahs Eruv. K'moshe mevarchim al Mikra Megillah ulahadlik ner shel Chanukah kol midrabanan. They're all DeRabanans, and they're all included under lo Tasur. So why do you stop here? You know, you're willing to count the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, mitzvah of Ner Chanukah and Taryag, but you're not willing to count Netilas Yadayim and Eruv? And we make a bracha on all of these, Heichon Tzivanu lo Tasur. And now we take a look at the Ramban, and the Ramban is going to dedicate pages upon pages to understand this entire enterprise of counting Taryag. And if we understand the meaning of Taryag, I'm not talking about some sort of Kabbalistic meaning. But what does the Gemara mean that 613 mitzvahs were given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai? If we understand that, then we could put the Bahag into a certain frame of reference and make sense out of the Bahag and defend him against the onslaught of the Ram. So Ramban has taken upon himself a tremendous, colossal enterprise, an agenda, the goal of which is to defend the Bahag, that we will count DeRabanans in Taryag, but only certain DeRabanans, and not all of them. He says that the Rambam, Heshiv al Harav HaGadol Baal Halachas Gedolos, Secher Tzadik Livracha. Because the Bahag is guilty in the Rambam's words of counting b'minyan ha-mitzvahs mikra megillah v'ner Chanukah b'chal mitzvasei mea brachos b'chol yom nicham avelim b'ikr cholim tvurus meisim al bosh sarumim chishuv tkufas mazolos.
What's the criteria? What's the criteria when you count the DeRabanans?
Correct. The Rambam is saying, what is your criterion? First of all, the Rambam is saying, how can you have the audacity to count mitzvahs DeRabanan on the Nemru L'Moshe Misinai? And secondly, if so, and you're going to subsume it under Lo Tasur, and it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Sinai, why do you differentiate? What's your criterion, as you say, to choose these mitzvahs DeRabanan and not others? What about Netilas Yadayim? What about Erevim? Lefisha anu elu kula mitzvahs DeRabanan ve'enim shel Torah. U'tshuvosav al zeh tshuvos gedolos mi'od ke'ilu machrichos lahodos bahen. The arguments of the Rambam are so powerful. The onslaught against the Bahag is so fundamental that we don't even begin to understand the Bahag. But terem askil ledaber im levavi. Okay, the Ramban waxes very poetic here. Be'inyan hazeh. Before I get to the kishkis of how to understand the Bahag and why do we add DeRabanans to the counting and the calculation of Taryag and why these mitzvahs are not others, Omer Mashin is topical. Let me share with you my confusion about this whole enterprise of Taryag mitzvahs. I'm telling you, Rabbosai, if I would say this today, you would brand me an apikoros, but the Ramban could get away with it. He doesn't understand the entire enterprise called 613 mitzvahs. Afal Pishia Daiti, I have to admit, Shakol Machzikim Bo Kedover Pashut. Everybody assumes without question that there are 613 mitzvahs. Based on the Gemara of Rav Simloi at the end of Masechta Makis, 613 mitzvahs were given at Har Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu. There are 365 Keminyan Yemos Hachama, and Mosayim v'Arboim U'Shmona Keneged Eivarav Shel Adam. So if we add 365 to 248, we get 613. V'Yom Rav Hamnuna Ma'ikra, what's the pasuk? How do you know 613? Torah Tzivalanu Moshe, Torah v'Gematria Hachi Havi. Right, it's Tofresh Yuda Aleph, 611. Anochi V'Liyah Mipi Agvura Shamim, that jacks it up to 613. Based on this statement of Rav Simloi at the end of Makis, the Baal Halachas took upon himself the agenda, the enterprise of counting every single mitzvah to finally get to the number 613, Limtzo Cheshman to find the calculation. And after the Bahag, Achrav Nispashid Adover Mi'od, it became very popular, this whole endeavor to find and list the 613. All the scholars and their students all agree, Nisparsim Bamon, and it was publicly accepted by the multitudes, by the masses. Shezeh Schum Kol HaMitzvos, the final calculation and the number has to be 613. Right there, that's Rav Sajigo, and he wrote a whole long liturgical poem in which he summarizes the 613. Mehem lechachmei Sfarad Rabos miod be'eretz Andalus. It's very common in France and other countries that the Sfardim, in Spain, they do this. It became a whole a whole enterprise, to poetically enumerate the 613. Kasher Hizkir Rav Zatzal Bakdama, as he mentions in his introduction, Mehem B'Artzos Acheres B'Chol Pinas Hagola, all over the diaspora. This has become a favorite, enterprise. Let's come up with the 613. Ukvar Omar Rav Zal Shezeh Dover Shelo Yisakel Oso Echad Mikol Misha Mona Mitzvah Shezeu Minyanom. We don't have an exact list that is absolutely authoritative that all will agree that this is the list of 613. Vani ba'anyim kol zeh ola belibi safek al zu amem. The Ramban admits that despite the popularity and the unanimous acceptance of the magic number 613, I have doubts about it. Imhi divrei hakol. Did everybody accept this? Maybe Rav Simlai was just one opinion. Oh, yesh b'zeh machlokes. Maybe there are other dissenting views, and the magic number is not 613. V'safek acher imhi halach l'Moshe Sinai. Is this a part of the basic fundamental belief that we have that this 613 that Hashem, this is a fundamental belief that Hashem says, I'm going to give you 613 mitzvahs. Oh, possibly. Who asmachta b'alma? This whole gematria of Torah equals 611, Anochi v'lo yeh, jacks it up to 613. That's all an asmachta. Shezeh Chacham, Rav Simlai, Adori said, Matzah mitzvahs came. He, Rav Simlai, made a list for himself of the mitzvahs, and the list came out to what? What was the final number? 613. So now he finds an asmachta for his counting of the 613, but that's his own personal opinion. According to his minyan, his calculation, there's 613, and he gave a simon. Rav Nuna came right after Rav Simlai. He came up with the gematria. So why is the Ramban pushing the envelope to reject this concept of 613? What bothers him about a concept that's so widely accepted, based on which not only the Gemara came up with gematrios to support it, but the Chachmei Sfarad wrote piyutim and shirim v'zmiros to come up with the number 613, and the Bahag wrote an entire treatise 613, and the Rambam wrote an entire treatise 613. Why is the Ramban a doubter? Why is he doubting this?
Could it be because it's only mentioned by Rav Simlai in the 3rd or 4th century CE for the very first time?
Could be, but again, I would argue that there's so many things that Chazal say in the Gemara, and the Ramban is not going to question them. And the Ramban, by his own admission, tells us that this number 613 was accepted straight across the board. What bothers the Ramban? So I'm going to leave you with this. It's time to go. But sometimes, when you read a book, you don't. If you don't skip to the last page of the book, you get very excited about it. What bothers the Ramban? The Ramban is so upset about this enterprise called Minyan HaMitzvahs, and about this premise that there are 613, that the Ramban is willing to single-handedly take on all the Mefarshim, argue against all the Rishonim, and come up with a different theory. That's the exciting news that we want to cover next week. Okay, then?
Yep.
So let me wish you a great Hanukkah, a wonderful Hanukkah, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Welcome home.
Yeah.